Welcome back to Awakening Israel Ministries. We are completing our series, the Messianic Biblical Literature series, Messianic Prophetic Issues, Prophecy Issues in these writings. We're going to make two parts of part 15. This video is going to discuss the New Testament and how it is not Scripture. Let's take a look at the proof here we have that the New Testament is not Scripture. New Testament reliability is something that needs to be looked at, especially by Christians. Why don't we ask these questions? Why don't we look at authorship? Why don't we check on the dating of the books? It's one thing I was telling my wife just today. I was asking her, why we don't question, why people don't question, because of course she's knowledgeable, why they don't question who wrote the Bible. Okay, God wrote the Bible. That's just like the virgin birth. We say God impregnated Mary, but Mary had to have a seed. What seed was it that she received? A spiritual seed or an actual physical sperm received through the Holy Spirit? If it was received through a spiritual means, that seed would have had to have been spiritual, making Jesus a demigod with powers that people will say he had these powers, but nobody can prove that. Well, it's the same thing with the Old Testament. Okay, we say that it's completely inspired by an infallible, perfect God, but we find errors, contradictions, inconsistencies, fallacies, left and right. Verses that are written out of context in the New Testament, taken out of context, misquoted verses, omitted verses, inserted verses. Okay? Mistranslated verses. This is not infallible then, brothers and sisters. If God is a perfect God, then the book would also need to be perfect. Who wrote this book? Who made all these mistakes? And if you begin to study that, you'll find a tremendous amount of inconsistencies with authorship, with dating, with reliability. And that's what we're bringing out here. Simply that. That's all we're bringing out. We're taking a look at that. Okay? These things are very important. If you're going to believe in a book, that book, in my opinion, should be reliable. We should know who the authors are. We should know what the dating is. Okay? All right, let's take a look. Let's take a look here. We're going to cut this phone volume off. There we go. All right, so the New Testament is derived from the Old Testament teachings. Is it not, brothers and sisters? The New Testament is derived from the teachings of the Holy Scriptures of old, the ancient scriptures of the Old Testament. And we hear that and we see that and we know that, but we don't adhere to that. When we see discrepancies in the New Testament that we, cannot find in the Old Testament teachings and doctrines, why don't we question it? The New Testament reiterates the teachings and writings of the Old Testament. There is no question about this. The New Testament claims to speak of the messianic prophecies concerning Jesus the Christ. Yet, as we have shown in this teaching, Jesus did not actually fulfill any of the prophecies accredited to him. The writings of the Gospels were over 70 to 100 years ago, AD, a full century plus in some, versions of the dating, after the death of Jesus the Christ. None of the so-called authors of the New Testament are known. None of them. None of the so-called authors of the New Testament are known. If you can prove that to be incorrect, you'll be one of the first scholars to do that. Now, there is the most historicity is applied to Paul. Apparently, there's some historicity or proof that Paul actually existed, but it's very little proof, and there's still very much doubt to Paul actually being a real figure, because no one else is writing about Paul. Why didn't anybody else write about Paul? I mean, we had writers back then, brothers and sisters. We had historians. We had literary artists back then. We had scholars then. There were scholars in the earth then. They should have been writing about Jesus. They should have been writing about Paul. And Paul never claims to have met Jesus in the first place. Originally, So he can't prove Jesus existed. He's only telling you he existed in a spiritual form. He never saw that Jesus existed. You know, some of his stories state that he was doing things and killing Christians and, but if he still never met Jesus. Originally, these books started out as anonymous books, the books of the Old Testament. They were anonymous. There was no knowledge of who the writers were. None of these books were given authors until around the 2nd century AD. So we're talking up to 150 to 200 years AD. Jesus, we're talking over 100 plus years after his death. The dating of the Gospels, okay? So if we look at the Gospels, we see that Jesus died, right, in around 33 AD, so we're told. So we're not exactly sure about all of that, but we see that he supposedly died around 30 AD. Now, how about Paul's letters? Okay, Paul's letters, and I believe I need to make a correction on a previous video. I said Mark was dated around 50 AD, when actually that's Paul who had his epistles and his letters dated around, the late 50s AD. And then you have James, Peter, and Jude and Paul all die in the mid-60s. So they're all killed at that time. So if Peter is killed, when was his book written? That's pretty interesting, right? When was Peter written? Okay, I'm going to pull something up on that just briefly. Okay, so what I want to do is take you to this site, which is a really, really good site. It's called earlychristianwritings.com. Simple as that. And you'll get all of the non-canonical, the apocryphal books, all of the New Testament books that were approved by the Roman Catholic Church, and you'll get all of their dates. Now keep in mind that there are many, many of them. You see them here. There's many, many books that never made it into the Bible. Look at all these books. But let's just take a look at the ones in question here. So we're looking at the Gospel of Mark. They're saying it was around 65 to 80, right? So 65 to 80. Actually, that pulled it up, which I didn't want to do. Let's see here. Okay, so we looked at Mark coming around that time frame, and if we look at our listed time frame here for Mark, they're saying it was around, middle of the 70s. So all of these are very difficult to completely pinpoint, right? But we can at least look at these dates. Now, let's take a look at James dies in mid-60s. Peter dies in the mid-60s as well. So let's look at just want to look at when their books actually came out. Okay, so these may be, let's start with James. We'll just do a search here. So the Epistle of James is a letter of James, so that's probably not it. That's 70 to 100 AD. Should be the Gospel of James. We have the Secret Book of James. That's a second book of James. The second Apocalypse of James. Then we have the Infancy Gospel of James and the first Apocryphal Gospel of James. Well, let's see. I would be thinking we'd be looking for the Gospel of James. Well, let's just assume that the Epistle of James is the Gospel of James. So that's 70 to 100 AD. And as we can see here, James was dead by that time. Let's look at Peter. All right, remember this is earlychristianwritings.com. Such an excellent site for anybody who is interested in studying some of the things we mentioned, so the dating of the Bibles, the authorship, of the New Testament, and its authorship, okay, and its reliability. So if we look at Peter, we have the Gospel of Peter here, okay. So the Gospel of Peter is between 70 to 160 AD. That's a 90-year time span there, right? So that means it's very possible that, well, that's incorrect, because we're actually not. The Gospel of Peter was not canonized. It was First and Second Peter that was canonized. So here's First Peter around 80, even later to 110 AD. And let's see if we can find Second Peter based on that. Let's go backwards. So there's First Peter. Let's see where Second Peter pops up. We have, there it is, 100 to 160 AD. So see, this is why I'm writing this. Didn't we say that, this entire series is based on some of these major points, but we need to know how reliable is this New Testament? Where's the authorship? What's up with the dating? And so you can see some of those things are very easily accessed now on the internet. Okay, so let's continue on. We're looking at we looked at James, we looked at Peter, and the books were written after their deaths. So this is why we can't attribute, one of the reasons why we can't attribute those books to these authors. They weren't even alive when they were written. Now you could say, well, they wrote these books before they died and then they picked them up, but the writers of the books did not claim to be James, did not claim to be Peter. When you look at these books, it says the book according to James or according to Peter. Okay. Now we'll go ahead and continue on here. What our point was looking at the dating. We look at Mark, which is the original Synoptic Gospel, and Matthew and Luke came from that around 90. Okay, and in the 90s AD, and then we had John come around 100 AD. Let's just take a look at those while we're at it, since we got it up still. Let's look at Matthew, the Gospel. Matthew is 80 to 100 AD, so that coincides. I don't know what this guy's popping up for, something I clicked on about an atheist, so we'll get rid of him. And then, so that goes to speak on the same time frame, right? 80 to 100. What about Luke? Luke should be right in there somewhere. The Gospel of Luke, here it is right here, right? So the Gospel of Luke is there. What about John? So the Gospel of John, so first thing we had was the Gospel of John, and then we had, these other books that he wrote. Okay, and then you had Revelation. Let's see if we can find that. So I sidetracked a little bit just to show you some of the dating, so you can get some of these dates. Then you got these other books, Preaching of Paul, Epistles of Laodiceans, Questions of Mary, all these books that were considered to be Christian books, Christian writings from the New Testament, the Apocrypha, from the Gnostics and the Church Fathers, and more. And if you see more, you see Jewish, Christian, hypothesized sources, and it goes on. So you can really get a look at all of these. I guess, let me just click on the New Testament only. So you just get a list of those, but you don't get the dates. So that's what I like so much about the article, is you actually get the dates. Okay, so that is just something I wanted to share with you. Just another way to research some of these books, because we're looking for authenticity in these books, right? We're looking for authorship. Wouldn't that be important? Something that I thought was interesting here is that I listed that Matthew and Luke used the Gospel of Mark to write their Gospels, yet Mark does not mention the virgin birth. He doesn't mention the trip to Egypt. He doesn't mention Nazareth. He also doesn't mention the same things about the resurrection. So there's a lot of discrepancies there. So let's continue on. As we can see, we've seen this slide before. Matthew and Luke clearly derived their major content from Mark. So we can see they took the majority of their content from Mark, and then they made up some of their own. Okay, some of the things they agree upon here, but they have their own doctrine as well. You see that here and here. All right. So we've looked at that, and these are just some of the things we want to make sure we have an understanding on. Matthew and Luke are not original books. They were not written by a person named Luke and a person named Matthew. Matthew is said to have been a disciple, but he couldn't have been an eyewitness, because we see when the book was written around 90 AD. The book is not attested to him. So they're saying that the original manuscripts were anonymous for the Gospels. There's a lot of discrepancies in the authorship of the Gospels and the historicity of the Gospels, easily looked up on Wikipedia, easily looked up by Googling the historicity of the Gospels. Very, very much study and research has been done on these topics, because they haven't come back to reveal any kind of truth in the authorship or the historicity. All right, for the sake of time, because we've already gone on this one, gone over, I'm going to go ahead and try to move through this quickly. Looking at Paul's writings, there's only 6 books that are really said to, and scholars agree upon, are accredited to, well, this is 7 here. These 7 books are accredited to Paul. And these letters are, they're evenly divided on some of these. We have to remember Paul mostly wrote letters to churchgoers, to Christians, as he was trying to promote the doctrine. And these letters are thought to be pseudographic, which are, not, they're just basically fraudulent letters by about 80% of the scholars. And just so you know, pseudographic books are considered to be falsely ascribed to someone. So if they're pseudographic books, we really can't rely on them. Either they're falsely ascribed to someone that we know of or that we don't know of. But we want to look at these, and we can see the dates here. 50 to about 57 AD is when these books were supposedly written. Remember, Paul never claimed to have met Jesus. So he specifically wrote about a doctrine based on faith without ever meeting the real person. So he cannot prove that Jesus existed, and he does not go about proving that. Some of the main things Paul doesn't mention are the virgin birth and things like that. The way the Bible was actually obtained was through meetings of the church. Once the church began, the Roman Catholic Church began, and they began to take over different parts of the world, there were so many different belief systems that they had to come together in many of the councils. There are way more councils than the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, but they basically picked and chose what they wanted in the Bible. They burned all the other pre-Christian documents that proved the religion was fictitious by 391 AD, and in order to make the religion popular, what would they do? They would kill everyone who did not agree with the religion, and made laws prohibiting any public talk about religion. Is that not what goes on today? They make laws, and you can't say these things, you can't say those things. Even YouTube does it. You don't really have free speech, because you can easily be put in a bad situation legally for saying the wrong thing. So if you disagree with this religion, this new religion at the time of 325 AD, now we're not even talking about the aspect of this religion being new in 325 AD, and here this is almost 300 years after the death of Christ. Okay? It was made illegal to believe anything else, and they couldn't have any public talk about religion. It was illegal to disagree with the church by 380 AD. And today Christians are running around with the Bible. They don't even know what they are believing in, or what they're believing in was purposely planned out for them to believe by men, and they're saying, oh, these are inspired words of God, but it doesn't pan out that way when you research it, brothers and sisters, when you check the history. Emperor Constantine was the creator of this concept of Jesus Christ and all these attributes of Jesus Christ. With a conspiracy in mind, Constantine established the Roman Catholic Church for the sole purpose of controlling the masses, which they still do. Think about it. What else has religion done besides control the people? It hasn't fed the hungry. Oh, well, Christian missionaries feed the hungry, but they haven't eradicated hunger. Whereas Christianity is the largest religion in the world, it's responsible for some of the pillaging that goes on in other nations. I guess I don't want to get into that too deeply, but that's easily proven that Christianity is responsible for many of our wars. Okay, it was just an exorcism, and they were just exercising a new form of power, and this happened at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. That's just when they came into agreement on what they would preach and teach. All right, and the main questions debated had great influence on the nomination of Jesus Christ as its prophet and savior. The emperor claimed he saw a vision, of course, of the cross in the sun, which was common in those days, sun worship, and that he had been told to use the image as a sign of victory, but he was already a killer of thousands, having driven his army across Europe. Okay, so they created these concepts in their meetings. This wasn't their only meeting. They had many of them. All right, New Testament from Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia. And I say this because you can get this information quite easily. All right, the authorship is an area of long-standing and current research and debate, with different works posing different problems for identification. We see it right here. While the various works have traditional ascriptions of authorship, these ascriptions are in some cases defended by scholars and in other cases disputed or rejected. According to many, if not most, so most of the scholars and the critical scholars we're talking about, none of the authors of the Gospels were eyewitnesses or even explicitly claimed to be eyewitnesses. None of them. Bart Ehrman of the University of North Carolina has argued for a scholarly consensus that many New Testament books were not written by the individuals whose names are attached. He further argues that the Gospels were originally anonymous, and this is where I get this from. He's not the only one saying it, brothers and sisters. The Gospels were originally, in their original form, no names were attached to them, and the names were not ascribed to them until around 185 AD. That's very interesting. Other scholars concur with this, and it is the perspective of some writers that none were written in Palestine. Now, we've looked at this slide in previous slides, but I just thought it was very important to bring that back out. So none of these writers and these books were written. Well, I don't want to say that wrong, but no, it says some writers. It is perspective of some writers and scholars that none of these books were even written in Palestine. So we've got all of this action taking place in Israel, and none of the books, many scholars don't believe any of the books were actually written in Israel. Now, we've looked at this slide before as well, and I just wanted to reiterate that it is quite interesting that the Christ concept is not original. And these guys got together at the Council of Nicaea and they put all this together. They put all these things together. They had to decide on the virgin birth. They had to decide on the disciples and the crucifixion and the resurrection and the Trinity. And these are not new concepts. The entire world has been following these concepts for thousands and thousands of years. These are not new doctrines. The only difference is these are mythical doctrines. They're considered to be myths. But in Christianity, we're said to take everything literally. We're supposed to literally believe that someone died and was resurrected. We're supposed to literally believe their birthday was December 25th, and they had 12 disciples and literally walked on water, literally was crucified. The fact that Jesus didn't exist is another lesson that I'm not actually including with this Messianic Biblical Literature series. There's so much information on that. I want to make that a lesson in its own. I still want to keep it short. Maybe we can deal with separate topics one by one. But I am going to definitely do a lesson and a teaching that Jesus never existed. He never existed, brothers and sisters. So, unfortunately, I know a lot of you do not want to hear that, but it's just the way it is. You can't prove he existed. I couldn't prove he existed. No one can prove he existed. This is a problem that PhDs who have multiple PhDs have not been able to prove. Now, I set out to prove he existed, and you see where I wound up, not believing in the Bible at all. I do believe the Bible is filled with powerful positive information, but it is all stolen philosophy from either Egypt or some other previous culture or civilization. None of it is original. And Europeans, by the way, people, are not the first to have morals, okay? In fact, they learned their morals from the Egyptians. That's where it all came from, brothers and sisters. The Greeks, they lived and worked and studied under the Egyptians for many years until Egypt was vulnerable, and then they took Egypt down. And so Egypt simply took the information, said it was theirs, and they've been disseminating it to us for, what, 2,500 years or so? Yeah, that's about right. So that's basically how that works. I'm going to go ahead and shut this lesson down. Definitely didn't mean to make it 26 minutes. I'm trying to keep them under 15. However, as you can see in this video, there was a lot of valuable information and I wanted to share with you. So we'll get on to the next part of this video shortly.